Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that challenges everything you thought you knew about medieval Africa. Everyone remembers Mansa Musa as the man who crashed Cairo's gold market, the emperor so wealthy he made pharaohs look poor. But what if I told you that his legendary Hajj to Mecca wasn't just a religious pilgrimage or a chance to show off unimaginable wealth? What if it was the most sophisticated diplomatic mission of the 14th century, a calculated strategy that transformed a desert trading post into one of the world's great centers of learning and power? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's the year 1324, and across the known world, from the courts of Europe to the palaces of China, traders and diplomats are about to witness something unprecedented. A West African emperor is preparing to undertake a pilgrimage to Mecca, and he's bringing along 60,000 people, 80 camels loaded with gold dust, and a vision for his capital city that will echo through the centuries. This wasn't just wealth on display. This was statecraft at its finest, dressed in gold cloth and traveling at camel pace across the Sahara. For those of you who remember when the evening news was just beginning to report on African independence in the 1960s, or when you first learned about African history in school, if you learned about it at all, tonight's story might surprise you. The Africa of Mansa Musa's time was sophisticated, wealthy beyond European imagination, and politically complex in ways that would make modern diplomats nod in recognition. This wasn't some primitive backwater. This was a civilization that understood power, trade, religion, and prestige better than most of medieval Europe. The gold standard myth, reframing Mansa Musa's legacy. We need to start by talking about gold, but only so we can move beyond it. Yes, Mansa Musa controlled approximately half of the world's gold supply in the 14th century. Yes, his personal wealth has been estimated, though such calculations are essentially meaningless given the different economic systems, at somewhere around $400 billion in modern terms. Yes, he gave away so much gold in Cairo during his Hajj that it caused inflation for a decade. These facts are extraordinary. They're also incomplete. The real story isn't that Mansa Musa had gold. Gold was Mali's strategic resource, certainly, but it was what he did with it that mattered. And what he did was use it as a tool for something far more valuable: diplomatic recognition, intellectual capital, and the kind of soft power that outlasts any treasury. The Mali Empire didn't become influential because it was rich. It became rich because it was strategically positioned and brilliantly managed. The wealth was a symptom of good governance, not the cause of it. Think about it this way. Some of you might remember the Marshall Plan after World War II, when America sent billions of dollars to rebuild Europe. Was that just charity? Was it just America showing off how rich it was? Of course not. It was strategic diplomacy, creating allies, establishing economic relationships, ensuring that Europe would be stable and aligned with American interests. Mansa Musa understood this principle 600 years earlier. The Mali Empire's gold came primarily from mines south of the empire proper, in regions of modern Ghana and Burkina Faso. The Wangara people, specialized gold miners and traders, extracted it from alluvial deposits using techniques passed down through generations. But here's what made Mali special. Mansa Musa controlled not the mines themselves, but the trade routes. He controlled access. He controlled distribution. He controlled the information about where the gold came from, a state secret so closely guarded that even Arab geographers who wrote extensively about Mali never knew the exact locations of the sources. This is sophisticated economic statecraft. It's one thing to have a resource. It's another thing entirely to control every aspect of its movement through the world economy. The Mali Empire's administration understood monopoly power, understood the importance of mystique, understood that scarcity was as important as abundance. They weren't just sitting on piles of gold. They were managing a strategic commodity with the care of modern petroleum exporters managing oil reserves. But gold was just the beginning. Mansa Musa's real innovation was understanding that in the medieval world, three things created lasting power: trade routes, religious legitimacy, and intellectual prestige. Europe at this time was fighting the 100 Years' War, burning heretics, and generally making a mess of things. The Islamic world, by contrast, was experiencing a golden age of learning, trade, and relative stability. And Mansa Musa positioned the Mali Empire at the crossroads of this Islamic world, geographically distant from its centers, but culturally and economically connected. His Hajj to Mecca in 1324 wasn't an accident or merely a religious obligation. It was a coming-out party for an empire most of the Islamic world knew about only through merchants' tales and the gold coins that flowed north across the Sahara. Mansa Musa was about to introduce himself, and he was going to make certain nobody forgot the introduction. The Hajj as diplomatic theater, strategic networking on a continental scale. Let's talk numbers for a moment because they matter. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage caravan included approximately 60,000 people, not 60 people, 60,000. That's larger than most medieval European cities. It included 500 slaves, each carrying a 6-pound golden staff, 80 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold dust. Royal officials, provincial governors, military commanders, scholars, jurists, interpreters, merchants, physicians, cooks, and entertainers. Entire families. Children born during the 2-year journey. This wasn't a pilgrimage. This was a mobile city crossing the Sahara Desert, then continuing through Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula to Mecca. The logistics alone are staggering. Water sources had to be identified months in advance. Food supplies for 60,000 people and thousands of animals. Campsites had to be organized every single night, a temporary city erected and dismantled daily. Security had to be maintained. Disputes had to be adjudicated. People got sick. People died. Babies were born. And through it all, the caravan maintained discipline and direction. Those of you who served in the military will appreciate what this means. Moving 60,000 people across hostile terrain requires planning that would impress any modern logistics officer. You need advanced scouts, rear guards, quartermaster corps, medical units, reconnaissance, supply chains, command structures, communication systems. The Mali Empire had all of this, coordinated by officials who could neither read nor write in many cases, using oral tradition and practical experience to manage complexity that would challenge modern administrators. But here's the genius part. Every single night, when that enormous caravan made camp, it became a diplomatic reception. Local rulers would visit. Merchants would arrive to trade. Scholars would seek audience. Word spread ahead of the caravan like ripples from a stone dropped in water. By the time Mansa Musa reached Egypt, his reputation preceded him by months. This was intentional. The caravan moved slowly, averaging maybe 10 to 12 miles per day across the desert. That's deliberate pacing. A smaller, faster group could have made the journey in half the time, but speed wasn't the objective. Impact was the objective. Mansa Musa wanted every trading post, every oasis, every town along the route to witness Mali's power firsthand. He wanted stories told and retold. He wanted merchants carrying tales back to their home cities. He wanted the Islamic world talking about Mali before he even arrived in Cairo. Contemporary Arab chronicles describe the effect. Ibn Fadl Allah al-Umari, writing in Cairo just a few years after Mansa Musa's visit, interviewed residents who remembered it. One merchant told him, "There has been no year like this year for the abundance and magnificence of the goods and gifts." Al-Umari himself wrote that Mali's ruler is the most powerful, the richest, the most fortunate, the most feared by his enemies, and the most able to do good to those around him. That's exactly the impression Mansa Musa intended to create. But notice what's missing from these descriptions. Nobody called him barbaric. Nobody called his people primitive. Nobody dismissed Mali as a backward kingdom. The Arab scholars who wrote about Mansa Musa treated him as an equal, a legitimate Islamic monarch whose power and piety deserved respect. That recognition, that legitimacy, was worth more than all the gold he carried. Cairo, the first impression and its calculated consequences. When Mansa Musa's caravan arrived in Cairo in July 1324, he entered one of the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated cities in the world. Cairo at this time had a population approaching 500,000 people. It was the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, a military state that controlled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Its markets dealt in goods from China to Spain. Its scholars debated theology, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Its architecture rivaled anything in Europe or Asia. In other words, this wasn't some provincial outpost where a regional king might impress the locals. This was the big leagues, and Mansa Musa understood he was being evaluated by people who had seen everything. So he did something calculated to generate maximum impact. He gave away gold, lots and lots of gold. The chronicler Al-Umari recorded what happened. He gave away so much gold in alms and gifts that the price of gold fell in Egypt and did not recover for 12 years afterward. Let's think about what that means economically. Egypt's economy was sophisticated enough to experience inflation from a sudden influx of precious metal. The gold-to-silver exchange rate shifted dramatically. Merchants who had accepted Mansa Musa's gold for goods found their wealth diminished as prices adjusted. The Mamluk government's finances, which depended on stable currency values, were disrupted. Mansa Musa had essentially hacked Cairo's monetary system, whether intentionally or not. Some historians argue it was accidental, that he simply didn't understand Egyptian economics. Those historians are probably underestimating him. This was a man who controlled a trade empire spanning thousands of miles. He understood commerce. He understood value. He understood that every merchant he enriched would tell stories about Mali's wealth. He understood that causing economic disruption would make his visit unforgettable. And here's where it gets interesting. On his return journey through Cairo a year later, Mansa Musa borrowed gold from Egyptian money lenders at high interest rates. Some chroniclers say this was because he'd given away too much and needed funds for the journey home. But consider another interpretation. By borrowing, he entered into credit relationships with Cairo's banking families. He created obligations and connections. He demonstrated that Mali honored its debts. He established his kingdom's creditworthiness in the medieval Islamic financial system. Those of you who built businesses or worked in finance will recognize this strategy. You don't just want to be known as wealthy. You want to be known as reliable. You want to be integrated into the financial networks. You want counterparties who have a stake in your success. Mansa Musa's loans from Cairo, which Mali did repay, establishing a precedent, did more for the empire's long-term commercial relationships than any amount of gold given away as charity. But the gold wasn't the only gift. Mansa Musa brought scholars, architects, and artisans back to Mali from Cairo. He offered generous salaries to anyone willing to travel to Timbuktu. He commissioned buildings. He purchased books, thousands of books at a time when books were hand-copied treasures. He established relationships with Cairo's intellectual elite, making Mali a participant in the broader Islamic scholarly world. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Nasir Mohammed, received Mansa Musa with full honors. They exchanged gifts. They discussed theology and politics. The Sultan, recognizing Mali's importance to the trans-Saharan trade that enriched Egypt, treated Mansa Musa as a peer. This diplomatic recognition from one of Islam's most powerful rulers elevated Mali's status across the entire Islamic world. Mali wasn't just a distant source of gold anymore. It was a legitimate Islamic sultanate, whose ruler had made the Hajj distributed charity on a legendary scale, and earned respect from the Mamluk Sultan himself. Think about the parallel to modern state visits. When a head of state visits Washington or Moscow or Beijing, it's not just about the meetings. It's about the photo opportunities, the joint statements, the symbolic gestures. It's about being seen as legitimate by the powers that matter. Mansa Musa's reception in Cairo served the same function. Every scholar who wrote about it, every merchant who witnessed it, every official who participated in it, they all became carriers of Mali's reputation. And reputation was currency in the medieval world, maybe more so than today. There was no CNN, no internet, no instant global communication. Information traveled at the speed of camels and ships. What people said about you, what stories merchants told, what scholars wrote in their chronicles, that determined how you were perceived across thousands of miles and across generations. Mansa Musa invested heavily in managing Mali's reputation, and Cairo was his stage. Mecca, the spiritual and political heart of the Islamic world. After Cairo, Mansa Musa's caravan continued to Mecca, arriving during the Hajj season of 1324. This was the spiritual climax of his journey, but it was also a political opportunity. During Hajj, the entire Islamic world converged on a single city. Scholars from Al-Andalus in Spain, merchants from Delhi and Samarkand, mystics from Persia, administrators from Damascus, pilgrims from Java and the Philippines. Every language of the Islamic world, every school of law, every interpretation of theology, all represented, all performing the same rituals together. For a ruler seeking to establish his kingdom's place in this world, there was no better networking event, and Mansa Musa worked it. Contemporary accounts describe him seeking out scholars, engaging in theological discussions, asking questions about Islamic law and its application in diverse societies. He wasn't just fulfilling a religious obligation. He was learning, gathering information, establishing relationships, and demonstrating that Mali's emperor was not just wealthy but intellectually curious and pious. The scholars Mansa Musa met in Mecca would return to their home cities carrying stories of Mali. Some would later accept his invitations to teach in Timbuktu. Others would write about him in their chronicles and treatises. The networks formed during Hajj were long-lasting. A scholar from Baghdad who met Mansa Musa in 1324 might correspond with Malian scholars for decades afterward, exchanging ideas, debating interpretations of law, sharing scientific knowledge. This was soft power at its most effective. You couldn't conquer the Islamic world militarily. It was too vast, too diverse, too protected by distance and desert. But you could make yourself indispensable to it economically through trade. You could earn respect through piety and proper religious observance. You could gain prestige through intellectual contributions. And you could establish legitimacy through recognition by other Muslim rulers and scholars. Mansa Musa understood all of this. Some historians have portrayed him as a simple-minded man whose only talent was being born into control of gold mines. That's profoundly wrong and probably shaped by Eurocentric biases. The man who orchestrated this 2-year diplomatic mission, who managed to position an empire on the edge of the Sahara as a major player in the Islamic world, who created lasting institutions and relationships, that man was a sophisticated strategist. Those of you who served in military or diplomatic roles will recognize the pattern. When you wanted to build alliances, you didn't just show up with weapons or money. You built personal relationships. You showed respect for local customs. You demonstrated that you understood the other party's concerns and values. You proved you were reliable. You found common ground. Mansa Musa did all of this, across cultures and thousands of miles, 6 centuries before international relations became a formal academic discipline. The Hajj also served a domestic political function. Mansa Musa returned to Mali with enhanced religious legitimacy. He had fulfilled Islam's most important pilgrimage. He had prayed at the Kaaba. He had demonstrated his piety before the entire Islamic world. This strengthened his authority among Mali's Muslims and provided a model for his subjects. A ruler who takes religion seriously commands more respect than one who merely pays it lip service. The return journey, solidifying alliances and gathering resources. The return journey took Mansa Musa back through Cairo, where, as mentioned, he borrowed gold to compensate for his earlier generosity. But he also made purchases, books primarily. In the medieval Islamic world, books were luxury items. Each one was hand-copied by scribes, often illuminated with beautiful calligraphy and decorations. A single significant text might take months to produce. Owning a large library was a mark of civilization and learning. Mansa Musa bought books on every subject available: theology, law, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, history, poetry. He was building the foundation for what he intended Timbuktu to become, a center of Islamic learning to rival Cairo, Baghdad, or Cordoba. The books he purchased in Cairo would seed libraries that would grow over the next 2 centuries into some of Islam's greatest repositories of knowledge. He also recruited. The sources mention specifically that he brought back several architects and scholars, including Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, a poet and architect from Granada in Al-Andalus. Al-Sahili was reportedly paid 200 mithqals of gold, about half a kilogram, in addition to his regular salary. That's serious money, indicating how much Mansa Musa valued expertise and talent. Al-Sahili would go on to design several of Mali's most important buildings, including the famous mosque at Gao and possibly contributing to the Jingreber Mosque in Timbuktu, though sources are unclear on this. His architectural style introduced burned brick construction to West Africa, replacing older construction methods with more durable techniques. This wasn't just about having pretty buildings. It was about demonstrating permanence, sophistication, and connection to the broader Islamic architectural tradition. Think about what this means in practical terms. You're a scholar in Cairo or Damascus. You hear that some emperor from West Africa is offering salaries multiple times what you might earn locally, plus the adventure of traveling to a distant land. plus the opportunity to build something new rather than just maintaining existing institutions. For the ambitious or curious, that's attractive. Mansa Musa was essentially poaching talent, offering incentives that could lure people across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. The sources also mention that Mansa Musa invited scholars to send their students to study in Timbuktu once he had established institutions there. This was visionary. He was creating a pull factor, making Mali not just a place that sent students abroad but a destination that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. Within a generation, that's exactly what happened. The journey back to Mali took months. Some of the travelers, particularly the Arab scholars, were experiencing West Africa for the first time. Their impressions would shape how the Islamic world understood Mali. This is where cultural exchange became reciprocal. Mansa Musa had learned from Cairo and Mecca. Now Cairo and Mecca would learn from Mali through the eyes of the scholars who traveled there. One account describes the astonishment of Arab travelers at Mali's system of justice and the safety of its roads. Under Mansa Musa's administration, a traveler could cross Mali's vast territory with valuable goods and face minimal risk of robbery. The punishment for theft was severe, and the administration's reach was long. This stability was essential for trade, and trade was essential for Mali's prosperity. Those who served in any capacity during the Cold War will remember how important perception was. What people believed about you, your strength, your resolve, your capabilities, often mattered more than the reality. Mansa Musa's Hajj was an exercise in managing perception, and by all accounts he succeeded brilliantly. The Islamic world now knew Mali existed, knew it was wealthy and powerful, knew its emperor was pious and generous, and knew it was a place where opportunities existed. That perception would shape Mali's relationships for generations. Timbuktu's transformation begins. From trading post to imperial capital. Timbuktu before Mansa Musa was a trading post, important but not exceptional. It sat at the point where the Niger River bent northward, making it the natural place for trans-Saharan caravans to meet river trade. Salt from the Saharan mines at Tagheza could be exchanged for gold and other goods brought up the river from the south. It was commercial geography, nothing more. The name itself supposedly came from a Tuareg woman called Buktu who kept a well there. Tim, meaning place of in the Tuareg language, place of Buktu's well. The settlement grew up around reliable water and a strategic location, the same reason humans have built cities since the beginning of time. But Mansa Musa saw something more. He saw a city positioned between the Islamic world he had just visited and the African interior where Mali's power was strongest. He saw a place that could become a cultural bridge, connecting the scholarly traditions of the Mediterranean world with the commercial wealth of West Africa. He saw an empty canvas where he could build something magnificent. The first major construction project was the Jingreber Mosque, begun in 1327, 3 years after the Hajj. The sources credit Abu Ishaq al-Sahili with its design, though local architects certainly contributed. The mosque introduced a style that would become characteristic of Sahelian architecture: massive mud brick construction with the distinctive wooden Toron beams protruding from the walls, serving as both structural support and permanent scaffolding for the regular replastering required in this climate. The building process itself was an act of community organization. Mud brick construction in the Sahel required enormous amounts of labor. Earth had to be excavated, mixed with straw and water, formed into bricks and dried in the sun. Thousands upon thousands of bricks for a structure of this size. Then there was the actual construction, laying the bricks, applying mortar, building the walls thick enough to insulate against the desert heat, creating the distinctive pyramidal minaret that would become Timbuktu's signature landmark. This wasn't a European-style cathedral where a few skilled stone masons did the critical work. This was mass labor, the entire community participating, turning Timbuktu's construction into a communal effort that bound people to the city. Those who built it would defend it. Those who plastered its walls annually would maintain it. The architecture created social cohesion as much as it created buildings. Those of you who have ever been involved in major construction projects will appreciate the logistics. Material supply chains had to be organized. Workers had to be fed and paid. Skills had to be taught. The Arab architectural techniques al-Sahili brought had to be learned by local workers. Quality had to be maintained. Disputes had to be resolved. And all of this in a climate where temperatures could exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, where water was precious, where the Sahara's sand blew constantly, abrading everything. The Jingreber Mosque, when completed, could accommodate thousands of worshippers. It became not just a place of prayer but a center of learning, with scholars teaching in its courtyard and adjacent rooms. The mosque library began accumulating manuscripts, both those Mansa Musa had brought back from Cairo and new works being copied locally. The building made a statement. Timbuktu was now a proper Islamic city with the architecture to prove it. But Mansa Musa didn't stop with one mosque. He commissioned buildings throughout the city, madrasas, Islamic schools, palaces for provincial governors and important families, markets with permanent structures instead of temporary stalls, warehouses for the gold and salt trade, administrative buildings for the empire's bureaucracy. Timbuktu was being rebuilt from the ground up, transformed from a trading post into an imperial capital worthy of an empire that spanned from the Atlantic to the Sahara's deep interior. The economic impact was immediate. Construction meant jobs, thousands of them. Workers needed food, housing, and goods, stimulating the entire local economy. Architects and scholars being paid high salaries spent money in local markets. Merchants attracted by growing trade opportunities established permanent businesses. The money Mansa Musa had distributed in Cairo, much of it was now flowing back into Mali's economy through these construction and recruitment efforts. Only now it was building permanent institutions instead of just creating temporary amazement. This is economic development done right, not just extracting resources and shipping them elsewhere, not just accumulating wealth in royal treasuries, but investing in infrastructure, education, and institutional development that would outlast any individual ruler. Mansa Musa understood that empires built on gold alone were vulnerable. Empires built on knowledge, trade networks, and cultural prestige could last for centuries. The great mosques, architectural diplomacy, and sacred space. The construction of Timbuktu's great mosques, Jingreber, Sankor, and Sidi Yahya, created more than just places of worship. They created focal points for neighborhoods, centers of learning, and symbols of Timbuktu's transformation. Each mosque developed its own character and community. Sankor Mosque, built or significantly renovated during Mansa Musa's reign, became particularly associated with scholarship. The university that would later make Timbuktu famous grew from the teaching circles that met in and around Sankor. This wasn't a university in the European sense with formal administration and degree programs. It was more organic, scholars teaching, students studying, knowledge being transmitted and debated in an informal but rigorous system. The architectural style of these mosques communicated specific messages. The massive walls spoke of permanence and strength. The mud brick construction demonstrated adaptation to local climate and materials, showing respect for regional traditions even while incorporating Islamic architectural principles. The wooden Toron beams, besides their practical function, created a distinctive aesthetic that said, "This is Islamic architecture, but it's African Islamic architecture, unique to this place." Religious architecture always serves political purposes, whether acknowledged or not. These mosques announced that Timbuktu was a proper Islamic city, aligned with the broader Islamic world, worthy of respect and recognition. They attracted pilgrims and visiting scholars, who brought ideas and made connections. They housed libraries that preserved knowledge. They provided venues for debates and discussions that advanced scholarship. But they also created soft power. When a merchant from Morocco visited Timbuktu and prayed in a mosque that rivaled those of Fez or Marrakesh, he returned home with stories of Timbuktu's sophistication. When a scholar from Egypt taught in Sankor's courtyard, he wrote letters to colleagues describing the intellectual vitality he encountered. This positive reputation attracted more visitors, more scholars, more trade, a virtuous cycle of increasing prestige and prosperity. Those who lived through the American space program's early days will remember how much the moon landing mattered for American prestige. It wasn't just about getting to the moon. It was about demonstrating capability, showing that America could accomplish extraordinary things, proving that the American system worked. Timbuktu's mosques served similar purposes for Mali. They demonstrated that an African empire could create monumental architecture, maintain Islamic learning, and participate fully in the Islamic world's cultural life. The construction of these mosques also required maintaining networks with the Islamic world for specialized knowledge. While local builders could manage mud brick construction, certain elements, the proper orientation toward Mecca, the acoustic requirements for the call to prayer, the appropriate dimensions and proportions for a congregational mosque, required expertise that had to be imported or learned from Islamic architectural traditions. This created ongoing connections between Timbuktu and cities like Cairo, Fez, and Tunis, connections that facilitated the flow of scholars, ideas, and innovations. The annual replastering of these mosques became a community festival. Because mud brick architecture in the Sahel requires regular maintenance due to seasonal rains and wind erosion, the entire community would gather to replaster the walls, a practice that continues in Timbuktu to this day. This tradition turned maintenance into a ritual that reinforced community bonds and collective ownership of these monuments. The buildings belonged to everyone, and everyone participated in their preservation. Sankore University, building an intellectual powerhouse. Sankore University emerged gradually during and after Mansa Musa's reign, reaching its peak in the 15th and 16th centuries. But its foundations were laid during this transformative period. The model was based on other Islamic centers of learning. Cairo's Al-Azhar, Baghdad's House of Wisdom, though that had been destroyed by the Mongols before Mansa Musa's time, and the great madrasas of Persia and Central Asia. The curriculum covered what medieval Islamic education always covered: Quranic studies and tafsir interpretation, hadith, sayings of the Prophet, fiqh jurisprudence, Arabic grammar and linguistics, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. This wasn't narrow religious training. This was comprehensive education in all the sciences and humanities as understood in the 14th century Islamic world. Students came from across West Africa, from Gao and Jen, from regions of modern Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Mauritania. Some came from North Africa, attracted by Timbuktu's growing reputation. A few even came from as far as Egypt and the Hijaz, reversing the usual flow of African students going north to study. Timbuktu was becoming a destination, not just a source of students seeking education elsewhere. The teaching method was traditional for Islamic education. A master scholar would teach students who sat in circles around him, listening to lectures, engaging in discussions, memorizing texts, and copying manuscripts. Students might study with multiple teachers, specializing in different fields. Advanced students would eventually receive ijaza, certification that they had mastered a text and were authorized to teach it themselves. This certification system created chains of transmission stretching back generations, connecting Timbuktu's scholars to the broader Islamic scholarly world. Manuscript production was central to the educational process. Students learned by copying important texts under their teacher's supervision. This served multiple purposes. It helped students internalize the material, it produced new copies of important works, and it trained scholars in the precision and clarity required for good scholarship. A student who could produce a clean, accurate copy of a complex legal text had demonstrated mastery of both content and form. Those who have pursued graduate education will recognize the system. It's not that different from how PhD programs still work. Intensive study with senior scholars, comprehensive exams, original research, and eventual authorization to teach others. The specific content was different, obviously, but the fundamental structure of knowledge transmission from master to student has remained remarkably constant across cultures and centuries. The library at Sankore grew to contain thousands of manuscripts. Some were brought back by Mansa Musa from his Hajj. Some were produced locally by students and scribes. Some were gifts from visiting scholars. Some were purchased by wealthy patrons. The collection covered every field of knowledge available in the Islamic world. Multiple copies of the Quran with various commentaries, collections of hadith, legal texts from all the major schools of Islamic law, medical treatises, astronomical tables, mathematical works, historical chronicles, poetry, and philosophical texts. These weren't just books gathering dust on shelves. They were working documents, constantly referenced, studied, annotated, and debated. Margins filled with notes as scholars added their interpretations and arguments. Pages wore smooth from handling. Bookmarks and ribbons marked frequently consulted passages. A manuscript from Sankore often showed evidence of multiple readers across generations, each adding their voice to an ongoing scholarly conversation. The economic value of these manuscripts was substantial. A single high-quality manuscript could be worth more than a horse. A scholar's personal library might represent wealth equivalent to a comfortable house. Book production supported an entire industry. Parchment makers, ink manufacturers, scribes, calligraphers, bookbinders, and merchants specializing in manuscript trade. Timbuktu's book market became famous across the Islamic world, attracting buyers from as far as Cairo and Baghdad. Faculty at Sankore developed reputations that attracted students from across the Islamic world. A famous legal scholar might have students traveling months just to study under him. A renowned doctor would attract aspiring physicians. The reputation of individual scholars became Timbuktu's reputation, creating a virtuous cycle where excellence attracted talent, which produced more excellence. The university also served as a center for original research and writing. Scholars produced new commentaries on classic texts, wrote new legal opinions addressing West African situations, compiled historical chronicles, and contributed to ongoing debates in Islamic theology and philosophy. Timbuktu's scholars weren't just preserving and transmitting knowledge from elsewhere. They were adding to it, making original contributions that circulated throughout the Islamic world. The library system, preserving and sharing knowledge. Beyond Sankor's institutional library, Timbuktu developed a culture of private libraries owned by wealthy families, merchants, and scholars. These private collections were often specialized, reflecting the owner's interests in scholarship. A legal scholar might have an extensive collection of fiqh texts from multiple schools of law. A medical doctor might accumulate the great works of Islamic medicine from Ibn Sina to local practitioners. These private libraries weren't hoarded. Islamic scholarship has a long tradition of libraries being made available to serious students. A wealthy merchant who owned a rare manuscript would loan it to a scholar for copying, producing 2 copies where one existed before. Knowledge was meant to be shared, not locked away, though obviously care had to be taken to preserve valuable manuscripts. The accumulation of manuscripts in Timbuktu represented a massive transfer of intellectual capital from the established centers of Islamic learning to this West African city. It was cultural appropriation in the best sense, not theft, but eager adoption and adaptation of knowledge from across the Islamic world, combined with local perspectives and needs. Library management required sophistication. Large collections needed cataloging systems so scholars could find specific works. They needed climate control, a challenge in Timbuktu's harsh environment where intense heat, seasonal humidity, and desert sand all threatened manuscripts. They needed security against fire, theft, and simple loss. They needed policies for lending, copying, and access. Timbuktu's librarians developed systems to address all these concerns. Manuscripts were cataloged by subject, author, and sometimes by chain of transmission for particularly important religious texts. They were stored in the coolest, driest parts of buildings, often in specially designed rooms with thick walls and minimal windows. Access was controlled but not overly restrictive. Serious scholars could generally get access to what they needed, but casual browsers were discouraged from handling rare manuscripts. The copying of manuscripts was strictly regulated to maintain quality. A student couldn't just grab any manuscript and copy it. They needed permission, supervision, and their work would be checked against the original. Poor quality copies could introduce errors that would propagate as subsequent scholars copied the flawed version. This quality control meant that manuscripts from Timbuktu's libraries were generally reliable, enhancing the city's scholarly reputation. The preservation of manuscripts required ongoing effort. Parchment deteriorates, ink fades, bindings wear out, pages tear. Libraries employed conservators skilled in manuscript repair and rebinding. Particularly valuable texts might be copied before the original deteriorated beyond usefulness, ensuring the content survived even if the original manuscript was lost. This investment in preservation paid long-term dividends. Some manuscripts produced or collected in Timbuktu during Mansa Musa's era still exist today, preserved by families who have maintained their scholarly libraries for 7 centuries. When modern scholars want to study Islamic jurisprudence, mathematics, or astronomy from medieval West Africa, they often find the evidence in Timbuktu's surviving manuscripts. Those who have ever worked in libraries or archives will appreciate the dedication required. Preservation is unglamorous work, often invisible when done well. But without it, knowledge is lost, history is forgotten, and civilizations leave fewer traces for future generations to study. Timbuktu's librarians and conservators were doing work as important as the scholars who wrote the texts. They were ensuring those texts would survive to be read by future generations. Attracting scholars, creating a brain magnet. Mansa Musa's most brilliant move was creating incentives for scholars to actually move to Timbuktu. It's one thing to build beautiful mosques and stock libraries with manuscripts. It's another thing entirely to convince established scholars to leave Cairo, Fez, or Damascus for a city that, a generation earlier, had been a dusty trading post in the middle of nowhere. The incentive package was comprehensive. First, generous salaries, multiples of what a scholar might earn in an established city. Second, prestigious positions. Coming to Timbuktu meant being a big fish in a growing pond rather than competing in saturated markets elsewhere. Third, resources, access to those growing libraries, capable students and wealthy patrons. Fourth, freedom. Scholars could pursue research and teaching without the intense political pressures present in cities closer to centers of power. Some scholars came for the adventure of it, the chance to see a different part of the Islamic world. Some came for career advancement, calculating that establishing themselves in Timbuktu's growing institutions offered better prospects than fighting for positions in Cairo or Baghdad. Some came for the intellectual freedom. While Timbuktu maintained Islamic orthodoxy, it wasn't as politically fraught as cities where every theological statement might be interpreted as commentary on current political disputes. The recruitment of scholars created network effects. When a prestigious scholar moved to Timbuktu, his students often followed. When those students established themselves, they attracted their own students. Scholarly families that had educated sons for generations might send one to Timbuktu to establish a branch of the family there, creating ties between Timbuktu and intellectual centers across the Islamic world. Letters between scholars became carriers of Timbuktu's reputation. A professor in Cairo might receive a letter from a former student now teaching in Timbuktu, describing the intellectual vitality, the quality of students, the generous patronage, the pleasant weather, well, by desert standards, and the opportunities available. These personal testimonials carried more weight than any official recruiting materials. Visiting scholars who came for short periods, perhaps a season of teaching, perhaps accompanying a trade caravan, returned to their home cities with first-hand accounts. Merchants who dealt in books would note that Timbuktu's market was competitive, that collectors there had good taste and deep pockets, that opportunities existed for those in the manuscript trade. Word spread through the informal networks that connected the Islamic world, and Timbuktu benefited from increasingly positive reputation. But attraction wasn't just about money and reputation. It was also about creating a genuine intellectual environment where good work could be done. Scholars needed colleagues to debate with, students to teach, libraries to research in, and patrons to support their work. Mansa Musa and his successors created all of this in Timbuktu, transforming it from a place scholars visited to a place scholars lived and worked. Those in academia or any field requiring specialized talent will recognize the challenge. You can't just declare yourself a center of excellence. You have to build it, person by person, creating an environment that attracts talent, supports good work, and develops the infrastructure and culture necessary for sustained achievement. Timbuktu did this in a single generation, a remarkable feat of institutional development. The brain drain from established centers benefited Timbuktu, obviously, but it also created resentment. Some scholars in North Africa grumbled about their talented colleagues abandoning established institutions for the Sahel's riches. Some saw it as mercenary, choosing gold over intellectual purity. But Timbuktu's scholars could reasonably argue that they were spreading Islamic learning to new regions, fulfilling the religion's mandate to pursue knowledge wherever it might lead. Trade routes and economic power, the foundation of everything. We need to talk about the money because without it, none of Mansa Musa's diplomatic and cultural achievements would have been possible. The Mali Empire's wealth came from controlling trade routes, particularly the gold-salt exchange that was the economic backbone of trans-Saharan commerce. Here's how it worked. Gold came from the southern reaches of the empire, from regions where the Wangara miners extracted it from rivers and shallow mines. Salt came from the Saharan mines at Taghaza, where it was cut from massive underground deposits and loaded onto camel caravans. Gold was abundant in West Africa, but salt was scarce. Salt was abundant in the Sahara, but useless without markets. Timbuktu sat at the nexus where these trades met. The economics were extraordinary. In sub-Saharan Africa, salt could be worth its weight in gold, literally. A pound of salt might exchange for a pound of gold in some markets. The markup was tremendous because the cost of transporting salt across the Sahara was high, but nowhere near high enough to eliminate the profit margins. Merchants who successfully ran this trade could become extraordinarily wealthy. But Mali didn't just facilitate this trade, it controlled it. The empire's administration taxed trade at multiple points, generating revenue without disrupting commerce. Caravans paid taxes when entering Mali territory. Merchants paid market fees in Timbuktu and other trade cities. The royal monopoly on gold nuggets above a certain size meant the emperor personally controlled the most valuable specimens, even while gold dust could be traded freely. This taxation system was sophisticated for the 14th century. Too high, and merchants would seek alternative routes, depriving Mali of revenue. Too low, and the empire couldn't fund its administration, military, and cultural projects. Mali's rulers found a balance that kept trade flowing while generating enormous revenues. The system worked because Mali offered something valuable in return for those taxes: security. Those who have ever run a business will appreciate this. You might grumble about taxes, but if those taxes buy you infrastructure, security, and stable rule of law, you pay them because the alternative is worse. Mali's administration ensured that trade routes were safe, that disputes were adjudicated fairly, that weights and measures were standardized, and that merchants who played by the rules were protected. That was worth paying for. The trans-Saharan trade wasn't just gold and salt. Mali also exported kola nuts, which were valuable across the Islamic world as a mild stimulant. They exported leather goods, particularly fine leather work from Timbuktu's craftsmen. They exported enslaved people, a dark reality of medieval African commerce that we need to acknowledge honestly. They imported horses from North Africa, crucial for cavalry that maintained the empire. They imported manufactured goods, textiles, weapons, books, and luxury items. Timbuktu became a trading hub because of its geography, but it remained one because of deliberate policy. The city's markets were well regulated. Merchants from different regions had designated areas. Disputes were handled by Islamic commercial law as interpreted by Timbuktu's qadis, judges. The city invested in infrastructure, warehouses for goods in transit, caravanserais for merchants and their animals, markets with permanent structures. The security of trade routes extended hundreds of miles. Mali maintained military outposts, enforced its law, and punished robbery severely. The famous 14th century traveler Ibn Battuta, who visited Mali in the 1350s, noted with amazement that a traveler could cross Mali's vast territory with valuables and face minimal risk. That security was a public good that benefited everyone and maintained Mali's position as the preferred route for trans-Saharan trade. Some of you who served in transportation, logistics, or supply chain management will recognize what Mali created: an integrated system where each component supported the others. Production of goods, transportation infrastructure, market facilities, legal frameworks for commerce, security along routes, and taxation that funded the whole system. Break any link and the chain fails. Maintain all of them and wealth flows. The revenue from trade funded everything else we've discussed. The mosques, the universities, the scholar salaries, the manuscript purchases, the architectural projects, all of it depended on the steady flow of gold, salt, and goods through Timbuktu. Mansa Musa's genius was recognizing that military power alone couldn't sustain this. You needed reputation, legitimacy, cultural prestige, and religious authority. You needed people across the Islamic world to see Mali as a civilization worthy of partnership, not just a source of gold to be exploited. The gold-salt exchange, economic diplomacy in action. The gold-salt trade was more than economics. It was diplomacy. Every transaction connected people across vast distances. A Tuareg caravan leader from the northern Sahara trading salt for gold was connecting his community to networks extending south into the gold fields and north to Mediterranean markets. A Soninke merchant accepting gold from interior regions and passing it to trans-Saharan traders was facilitating connections between worlds. These commercial relationships required trust. You don't hand over valuable goods to strangers without some assurance you'll receive fair value in return. The trust was built through repeated interactions, through reputation, through the enforcement of commercial law, and through cultural frameworks that encouraged honest dealing. Islamic commercial law, which had been developing for centuries across the Muslim world, provided standardized rules for transactions. What constituted a binding agreement? What recourse did parties have if one side failed to deliver? How should quality be verified? What happens if goods are damaged in transit? These questions had answers in the legal tradition, and Timbuktu's Qadis applied those answers to commercial disputes. But beyond formal law, there was commercial culture. Merchants developed reputations over years or even generations. A merchant family known for fair dealing could command better prices and preferential treatment because their word was trusted. A merchant who cheated or sold inferior goods found doors closing, credit becoming unavailable, partnerships dissolving. In a commercial world based on personal relationships and reputation, dishonesty was bad business. The standardization of weights and measures was crucial. Mali maintained official standards, and market officials verified that merchants' scales were accurate. This seems basic, but in medieval commerce where every region had its own units, standardization reduced transaction costs and prevented disputes. A trader from Cairo knew that the mythical weight used in Timbuktu corresponded to weights elsewhere in the Islamic world, making calculations and comparisons possible. The gold-salt trade also created cultural exchange. Tuareg traders from the desert brought news, stories, and perspectives from the north. They brought Arabic books, North African fashion, and political gossip. They sometimes brought scholars or craftsmen seeking opportunities in Timbuktu. In return, they took back knowledge of West Africa, stories of Mali's wealth and sophistication, and personal connections they could leverage for future commercial opportunities. Those who have worked in international business will recognize this pattern. Before you can have successful commerce, you need relationships. Before relationships, you need contact. The trans-Saharan trade created those contacts, those relationships, and eventually those commercial partnerships that enriched everyone involved. The gold and salt were what brought people together. What kept them together was the mutual benefit, trust, and the networks of relationship that developed over time. Mansa Musa's Hajj, viewed through this lens, was the ultimate example of using wealth to build relationships. He wasn't just showing off. He was investing gold in diplomatic and commercial relationships that would benefit Mali for generations. The gold he gave away in Cairo came back to Mali many times over through enhanced trade, scholarly exchange, and political recognition. Legal and administrative reforms, the invisible foundation. The visible achievements, mosques, universities, diplomatic missions, rested on a foundation of administrative and legal reform that was less dramatic but equally important. Mansa Musa standardized legal practices across the empire, created administrative structures that could function without constant imperial supervision, and established systems that would outlast his reign. Islamic law, Sharia, provided the framework, but its application required interpretation and adaptation to local circumstances. Mansa Musa appointed qadis who were trained in Islamic jurisprudence but also understood West African realities. These judges handled commercial disputes, criminal cases, family law, and property rights. Their decisions created a body of precedent that guided future judgments, slowly building a consistent legal system. The administrative structure was hierarchical but relatively flexible. Provincial governors controlled major regions and cities. They collected taxes, maintained order, administered justice, and represented imperial authority. But they also had considerable autonomy to address local issues without waiting for direction from the capital. This decentralization was necessary given the empire's size and the difficulties of long-distance communication. Tax collection was systematized. Rather than arbitrary exactions, Mali established known rates for different types of commerce. This predictability encouraged trade because merchants could calculate costs and profits. It also reduced corruption because the standard rates were public knowledge, making it harder for local officials to demand extra payments. The military served dual purposes: defense against external threats and internal security. But Mali's military under Mansa Musa was also an administrative tool, capable of rapid communication, enforcement of imperial authority, and suppression of bandits or rebellious nobles. The empire maintained a professional corps of cavalry, supplemented by levies from provinces when needed. Those who served in government or military administration will appreciate the challenge of managing an empire before modern communication, before bureaucracies with permanent records, before the systems that we take for granted today. Mali's administration managed through human networks, oral tradition, and personal loyalty, combined with Islamic administrative practices borrowed from North African and Middle Eastern states. Legal reforms under Mansa Musa also addressed family law and property rights, both crucial for social stability. Clear rules about inheritance prevented disputes that could destabilize influential families. Standardized marriage contracts protected both parties and legitimized children's status. Property rights gave people incentive to invest and improve land, knowing their ownership would be respected. These might seem like mundane matters compared to grand mosques and diplomatic missions, but they're what allowed ordinary people to live stable lives, engage in commerce, educate their children, and participate in the broader economy. The visible achievements of Mansa Musa's reign were possible because the invisible administrative and legal infrastructure supported them. Document authentication was another area where Mali's administration showed sophistication. Official documents bore seals verifying their authenticity. The use of specific scribes, particular formats, and standardized language made forgery difficult. This created confidence in written agreements, encouraging commerce and legal clarity. Succession and legacy, institutionalizing achievement. Mansa Musa died around 1337, approximately 13 years after his famous Hajj. His exact death date is uncertain, as are many details of his final years, but the sources agree that he died peacefully, having ruled for about 25 years. The true test of his achievement wasn't what he accomplished during his lifetime, but whether it survived his death. Succession in medieval African empires could be chaotic. Mali followed the tradition that rulership passed within the royal lineage but didn't necessarily go to the eldest son. Various royal males had claims, and succession often involved political maneuvering, military strength, and support from key factions. Mansa Musa's succession planning tried to minimize this chaos by clearly designating his son, Magan, as his successor. Magan's reign was brief. He died within a year or two of taking power. But the succession passed peacefully to Mansa Sulayman, Musa's brother, who ruled for approximately 20 years, 1341–1360. This peaceful transition demonstrated that Mali's administrative structures were functioning, that the empire had developed beyond dependence on any single ruler's personality. Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan traveler, visited Mali during Sulayman's reign in 1352–1353. His detailed account provides our best eyewitness description of Mali at its height. He praised the empire's security, noting the safety of travel we've already mentioned. He described Timbuktu's scholarly activity, the quality of its judges and scholars, and the city's engagement with Islamic learning. He noted weaknesses too. He thought some local customs weren't properly Islamic, but his overall impression was of a sophisticated, well-governed Islamic empire. The institutions Mansa Musa created continued functioning. Sankore University kept attracting students. The libraries kept growing. New scholars arrived from across the Islamic world. Trade remained secure and profitable. The mosques were maintained and continued serving as centers of learning and worship. In short, Timbuktu's transformation proved sustainable. This is the hallmark of great leadership, creating institutions that don't depend on any single individual. Mediocre rulers build personal power that collapses when they die. Great rulers build systems that perpetuate themselves, that create value across generations, that embody principles and practices rather than just personal authority. Those of you who have built businesses or organizations know the challenge of the succession problem. How do you ensure that what you've built survives your departure? You institutionalize processes, train successors, create systems that can function without you, build culture that perpetuates values. Mansa Musa did all this at empire scale. The scholarly chains of transmission in Timbuktu's manuscripts tell this story beautifully. A manuscript might note, "This text was taught to me by Scholar A, who learned from Scholar B, who studied under Scholar C," tracing back sometimes through dozens of scholars over centuries. These chains connected Timbuktu's scholars to the broader Islamic intellectual tradition, but they also created local chains. Students who studied at Sankore in the 1360s were being taught by scholars who had studied there in the 1330s or had been recruited by Mansa Musa himself. Knowledge was being passed down, traditions were being established, and Timbuktu was becoming not just a place with universities, but a place with scholarly traditions. Comparative analysis, Timbuktu and other medieval centers. Let's be clear about what Mansa Musa accomplished. He didn't just create a nice little university in the African interior. He created an institution that belonged in conversations about the great centers of medieval Islamic learning. This wasn't empty boasting. It was recognized reality. Baghdad's House of Wisdom had been destroyed by Mongols in 1258, decades before Mansa Musa's hajj. That tragedy of civilization, hundreds of thousands of books destroyed, scholars killed, centuries of accumulated knowledge lost, left a gap in the Islamic world's intellectual infrastructure. Timbuktu couldn't replace Baghdad, but it could partially fill the void, becoming one of several important centers rather than competing with a single dominant institution. Cairo's Al-Azhar University, founded in 970, was nearly 400 years old when Mansa Musa visited. It was established, prestigious, connected to political power through the Fatimid and later Mamluk dynasties. Timbuktu couldn't match that history, but it offered something Al-Azhar didn't. It was a rising star, a place where ambitious scholars could make names for themselves rather than competing with entrenched hierarchies. Córdoba in Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, had a library that reportedly contained 400,000 volumes before the Christian Reconquista disrupted it. This number is probably exaggerated, but even if the real number was half that, it dwarfed Timbuktu's collections. But by Mansa Musa's time, Córdoba's golden age was ending. Christian kingdoms were conquering Muslim Spain. Scholars were migrating from Córdoba to safer regions. Again, Timbuktu benefited from being a rising center in a stable empire rather than a declining one in contested territory. Samarkand and Bukhara in Central Asia, Nishapur in Persia, Damascus in Syria, all these cities had scholarly traditions dating back centuries. Timbuktu was the new kid on the block, lacking that deep history. But it had advantages. It was wealthy, it was growing, it was stable, and it was hungry for scholars and knowledge. For an ambitious young scholar from North Africa or the Middle East, Timbuktu offered opportunities that might not exist in more established centers. The comparison that probably mattered most was with Fez and Marrakesh in Morocco, and Tunis in modern Tunisia. These were North African cities that Timbuktu directly competed with for scholars and students. They were much closer to the Mediterranean world, easier to reach, and had longer traditions. But Timbuktu's wealth, Mansa Musa's patronage, and the sense of being part of a great enterprise attracted some scholars away from North Africa despite the difficult journey. By the late 14th century, Islamic geographers were including Timbuktu in their maps and descriptions of the world. It had become a known place, not just a distant source of gold. Scholars in Baghdad or Damascus might not know much about it, but they knew it existed, knew it had universities and libraries, knew it was part of the Islamic scholarly world. That recognition, that inclusion in the mental map of Islamic civilization, was a major achievement in itself. Those who remember the Cold War competition between American and Soviet universities will recognize the pattern. Both sides wanted to create centers of excellence, to attract talent, to demonstrate that their system could produce world-class scholarship. Prestige mattered as much as actual research output sometimes. Timbuktu was engaged in a similar competition, not military or ideological, but a competition for scholarly prestige within the Islamic world. The decline and what remained. Nothing lasts forever. Nothing lasts forever, and that includes empires and their great cities. Mali's power began declining in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. The Songhai Empire, originally a vassal state, grew powerful and eventually conquered much of Mali's territory, including Timbuktu, around 1468. This changed Timbuktu's political situation, but didn't immediately destroy its scholarly institutions. In fact, Timbuktu's intellectual golden age arguably peaked under the Songhai Askia dynasty in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Askia Muhammad, ruled 1493–1528, was another ruler who understood soft power, who patronized scholars, and who used Islamic learning to legitimize his rule. The foundations Mansa Musa laid continued bearing fruit under new political management, but the vulnerabilities were apparent. Timbuktu depended on trans-Saharan trade for its prosperity. When Portuguese exploration opened sea routes around Africa, connecting Europe directly to West African gold sources and Asian trade goods, trans-Saharan trade began declining. It was slow at first, but inexorable. Why cross the Sahara when you could ship goods by sea? The catastrophic blow came in 1591, when Morocco invaded the Songhai Empire, seeking control of the trans-Saharan gold trade. The Moroccans had superior firearms against Songhai's cavalry and spears. They won the major battles and occupied Timbuktu. The occupation was brutal. Scholars were killed or forced into exile. Libraries were looted or destroyed. The scholarly community that had flourished for nearly 3 centuries was devastated. Some manuscripts survived, hidden by families who understood their value. Some scholars escaped to other cities. The knowledge didn't entirely disappear, but Timbuktu as a great center of learning effectively ended. The city continued existing, but as a shadow of its former glory, a remote provincial town in Morocco's tenuous desert empire, then later under various West African rulers. Those who lived through the fall of European empires after World War II, or who witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union, will recognize the pattern. Empires rise through combination of circumstances: geography, resources, leadership, timing. They peak when those factors align optimally. They decline when circumstances change and the factors that enabled their rise no longer function. Nothing about this is unique to Mali or Timbuktu. It's the pattern of history. But here's the remarkable thing: the manuscripts survived. Families in Timbuktu preserved their ancestors' libraries through centuries of political chaos, economic decline, colonial occupation, and modern instability. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scholars have cataloged these surviving manuscripts, finding treasures of medieval Islamic learning, West African history, and scientific knowledge. The Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu, established in the 1970s, houses thousands of manuscripts. Private family libraries hold thousands more. These documents, some dating to Mansa Musa's era, others from later periods, prove that Timbuktu really was what the medieval sources claimed: a great center of learning comparable to the most renowned institutions of the Islamic world. When Al-Qaeda affiliates occupied northern Mali in 2012–2013, they targeted Timbuktu's manuscripts, burning some and attempting to destroy this heritage. But local people smuggled thousands of manuscripts to safety, risking their lives to preserve knowledge their ancestors had protected for centuries. That's how much these manuscripts matter to Timbuktu's people. They're not just historical artifacts, but part of their identity and heritage. Modern lessons in soft power: what we can learn from Mansa Musa. Let's talk about why Mansa Musa's story matters beyond historical curiosity. The principles he employed: using wealth to build legitimacy, investing in cultural institutions, creating networks through generosity, demonstrating values through action rather than mere rhetoric. These remain relevant to how power and influence operate in the modern world. Modern diplomacy has a term that Mansa Musa would have understood: soft power. It's the ability to attract and persuade rather than coerce. It's built through culture, education, and the appeal of your values and achievements. Mansa Musa was a master of soft power 6 centuries before Joseph Nye coined the term. Consider how nations today compete for influence. They establish cultural centers abroad, offering language classes and cultural programs. They fund scholarship programs bringing foreign students to their universities. They broadcast their media internationally. They sponsor cultural events and exchanges. They invest in monumental architecture that demonstrates wealth and sophistication. They engage in highly visible acts of generosity. This is exactly what Mansa Musa did. The Djinguereber Mosque was monument architecture, demonstrating Mali's capability and commitment. Sankore University attracted foreign talent, creating cultural exchange and spreading Mali's influence. The Hajj itself was international engagement at the highest level, creating relationships and demonstrating values. The manuscript purchases were cultural investment, importing knowledge and demonstrating that Mali valued learning. The parallel extends to economic strategy. Modern nations understand that military power alone doesn't create sustainable influence. Economic integration, creating situations where other nations benefit from your prosperity, builds more lasting relationships than threats ever could. Mali's approach to trans-Saharan trade, facilitating rather than monopolizing, taxing but not strangling, providing security that benefited all participants, created a system where multiple parties prospered. Those who have worked in international relations, cultural diplomacy, or global business will recognize these patterns. The specific tools change. We have internet instead of camel caravans. Universities grant formal degrees instead of ijaza. Cultural centers replace teaching circles in mosque courtyards. But the fundamental principles remain constant. Influence flows from capability, legitimacy, cultural appeal, and the networks you create. Mansa Musa also understood something modern leaders sometimes forget. Reputation takes years to build and moments to destroy. He invested heavily in creating positive reputation for Mali, and that investment paid dividends for generations. But it required consistency. One diplomatic insult, one betrayal of commercial partners, one egregious act could have destroyed what he worked so hard to build. The emphasis on legitimacy through proper Islamic observance speaks to another modern reality. Alignment with valued ideologies or systems creates acceptance and influence. In Mansa Musa's time, being recognized as a legitimate Islamic ruler mattered across a vast region. Today, alignment with democracy, human rights, market economics, or other dominant ideologies serves similar functions. It creates legitimacy and acceptance in international systems. His focus on institutions rather than personal power shows sophisticated statecraft. Personal charisma and authority matter, but they die with the individual. Institutions, universities, legal systems, administrative structures, cultural traditions, these outlast any single person. Building institutional capacity is harder than accumulating personal power, but it creates more lasting impact. Perhaps the most important lesson is about investment in knowledge and education. Mansa Musa understood that while gold made Mali wealthy in his generation, knowledge would make it influential for centuries. The manuscripts he purchased, the scholars he recruited, the institutions he built. These were investments in human capital and intellectual infrastructure that paid returns long after the gold was spent. Modern economies increasingly recognize that human capital, educated, skilled populations, matters more than natural resources. Nations rich in oil but poor in education often struggle. Nations with few natural resources but strong educational systems often prosper. Mansa Musa understood this principle in the 14th century, even though his economy was based on gold and salt rather than information and services. Conclusion: the emperor who built with more than gold. So here we are at the end, looking back across 7 centuries at a man who changed African history through strategies that remain relevant today. Mansa Musa's Hajj in 1324 wasn't just a pilgrimage. It was an announcement. Mali is here, Mali matters. Mali belongs in conversation with the great powers and civilizations of the world. The gold was the hook, the thing that caught everyone's attention. But the diplomacy, the cultural investment, the institution building, that was the substance. He understood that you can't just buy respect or influence. You have to earn it through demonstrated capability, proper conduct, and contribution to the communities you're part of. Timbuktu's transformation from trading post to cultural capital took decades, involved thousands of people, required sustained investment, and depended on stability that Mansa Musa's administration provided. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't easy. It was a deliberate project executed with strategic vision and considerable resources, creating something that outlasted the political power that built it. The manuscripts preserved in Timbuktu's libraries connect us directly to that world. We can read what scholars in the 14th century wrote about law, astronomy, medicine, history. We can see the marginal notes where students questioned their teachers, where scholars disputed interpretations, where knowledge evolved through debate and discussion. These aren't just historical artifacts. They're proof that African civilization participated fully in the intellectual life of the medieval world. When we talk about Mansa Musa, we often focus on that spectacular Hajj, the gold given away in Cairo, the economic disruption he caused. But that misses the deeper story. The Hajj was one journey. The transformation of Timbuktu was a generation-long project. The scholarly traditions established then lasted for centuries. The manuscripts produced still exist. The mosques still stand. The memory of what Timbuktu represented, a center of learning, a beacon of civilization, a place where knowledge was valued above gold, that memory persists. Those of you who have spent careers building things, companies, institutions, families, communities, you understand that the visible achievements are just the top layer. Beneath them is infrastructure, systems, relationships, traditions, accumulated knowledge. Beneath that is vision, the understanding of what you're trying to create and why it matters. Mansa Musa had that vision. He saw Timbuktu not as it was, but as it could become. He also understood limits. He couldn't change Mali's geographic position or climate. He couldn't create gold where none existed or eliminate the Sahara's challenges. He worked within constraints, maximizing advantages and minimizing weaknesses. That's practical statecraft, not fantasy or wishful thinking. The decline of Mali and Timbuktu teaches us that nothing lasts forever. Circumstances change. New technologies disrupt established systems. Rising powers challenge established ones. But the knowledge created, the traditions established, the beauty built, these can persist even when the political and economic systems that created them disappear. Timbuktu's manuscripts outlasted the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, Moroccan occupation, French colonialism, and modern instability. That's resilience. For modern Africa, Mansa Musa and Timbuktu represent something important: evidence of historical greatness, proof that African civilizations built sophisticated institutions and participated in global networks. This matters psychologically and politically in a continent that experienced centuries of exploitation, slavery, and colonialism. The past can inform the present, providing examples and inspiration even while acknowledging that you can't recreate history. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about this. 700 years ago, in a city on the edge of the Sahara Desert, scholars from across the Islamic world gathered to debate law, study astronomy, copy manuscripts, and advance human knowledge. They did this because one emperor understood that wealth should serve purposes beyond accumulation. That power required legitimacy, and that influence came from contributions to civilization rather than just military conquest. Mansa Musa's gold is long gone, spent and dispersed across the medieval world, but his mosques still stand. His manuscripts survive. His example remains. That's the difference between spending wealth and investing it. That's the difference between power and influence. That's the difference between being rich and being significant. The story of Mansa Musa and Timbuktu reminds us that history is complex, that Africa's past includes sophistication and achievement, that the medieval world was more interconnected than we often imagine, and that strategic vision combined with resources can create lasting change. It also reminds us that no matter how great the achievement, time and circumstances eventually transform everything. As the candles dim in Timbuktu tonight, as they have every night for 700 years, the desert wind still whispers across the same sands that Mansa Musa's caravan crossed. The Niger still flows past the city, as it did when the first trading post was established. The stars still wheel overhead, the same stars that guided caravans and helped scholars calculate prayer times. Human empires rise and fall, borders shift, technologies transform society, but some things endure. The desire to learn, the impulse to create beauty, the attempt to build something meaningful, the hope that our efforts will matter beyond our brief lives. Mansa Musa succeeded in that. His name is remembered. His city, though diminished, survives. His investment in knowledge left manuscripts that scholars study today. His vision of Timbuktu as a great center of learning became reality, even if only for a few centuries. That's legacy. Not perfection, not permanence, but significance. Impact. Evidence that one person's vision, combined with resources and sustained effort, can transform a place and influence history. The gold he spent in Cairo bought a moment. The institutions he built in Timbuktu bought centuries. That's the difference between wealth and wisdom. And with that thought, perhaps you can close your eyes. Let the desert wind carry you to sleep, and dream of caravans crossing golden dunes, of scholars debating in cool courtyards, of manuscripts being carefully copied by lamplight, of a civilization that understood that knowledge was more precious than gold. And that influence came not from the sword, but from the strength of ideas and the beauty of what you built. Rest well, knowing that even across 7 centuries and vast distances, the principles of leadership, vision, and human achievement remain remarkably constant. The tools change. The circumstances change. But the fundamental truth persists. We are remembered not for what we take, but for what we build. Not for what we hoard, but for what we share. Not for our power, but for our contributions to human flourishing. The stars that guided Mansa Musa's caravan still shine tonight, indifferent to empire's rise and fall, witnessing quietly as they always have, eternal and patient, while we brief humans make our mark and pass on. leaving behind what we can, hoping it matters, knowing it might not, but building anyway because that's what we do. That's what we've always done, creating beauty and knowledge and meaning in the face of time's inevitable passage. Sleep well.